It's so nice to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm glad to be able to teach you about something I'm so passionate about. For my sabbatical studies that I was able to do in November and December this year, I started the journey of becoming a soferet. So a soferet is somebody who writes sacred texts. And we're going to get into what that means and who can do it and all of the different pieces that go along with it. But I have spent time studying with a couple of different teachers, one who taught me the art piece of it with the calligraphy and the lettering and the halakha that goes with that, because every letter has its own precise halakha and way of forming. And there's halakha, Jewish law, on the art of writing it in general and how to go everywhere from who's permitted to what kind of parchment you use and what side of the parchment you use and what kind of ink you use and what kind of everything. It's very precise. So we think about it as an art, but it is actually a science as well, because we have so many different pieces that have to come together in order to make a scroll or a piece of sacred text actually kosher. So I want to begin with a video. This is an interview with Julie Seltzer, who is a soferet in New York City, and she was commissioned to write a Torah by one of the museums. I think it's the Museum of Contemporary Jewish History. I have to look at that again. But she was commissioned to write a Torah there so that it could be a process that the entire community could be involved in. And she gave a really beautiful interview about what it means to write a Torah. And so I want to watch that with you as kind of a foundation. It's just a few minutes long. And then I prepared some texts and some things that I want to look at with you. And we're going to go from there. And then towards the end, I want to share a little bit. I don't want to do it for most of the time, but I'm going to do a demo so that you can see what it actually looks like to write and how we form letters and all of the different pieces that go along with that. So I'm going to begin the video and then we'll reconvene.
The Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and it's the source and base of the Jewish tradition revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by God. And we're the people of the book, so this is the book. When a Torah is read in synagogues, it has to be read from a scroll, and it has to be written in a particular way, by hand. My name is Julie Seltzer, and I'm currently working as a scribe, a soferet in Hebrew, which means that I write sacred writings. My role in this exhibit is to write a Torah that will be used in synagogues and in communities that are in need of a Torah. I'm a new scribe. This will be my first complete Torah. It's a science. It's a science that I'm still learning. Traditionally, you go to a school and you learn how to be a scribe as a student of scribing. But as a woman, these schools were not open to me. So in the beginning of my process, I looked online and I taught myself some of the basics. And then eventually I found a teacher. And from there, that's when I really started learning the craft and how to properly form the letters. And it's also when I began learning the laws associated with scribing. You start with parchment. And parchment is made from the skin of a kosher animal. And then there's something to write with, which is the quill, which is, for me, the most challenging aspect currently, cutting the quill from a feather. Just getting it the right size, the right sharpness, the right angle, the right flow of ink. Before starting a project, and often during a project, it's traditional to go to a mikveh, a ritual bath, which is really for spiritual elevation. And also before you begin the project, you have to state an intention out loud that you're doing this writing for the sake of the sanctity of what it is that you're writing. A Torah has 304,805 letters. Not one more, not one less, or else the entire thing is invalid. Every letter has rules that govern how the letter has to be written, because a letter can't look too much like another letter. If you look at a Torah closely, there are score lines. At the top of each line, there's an indentation, and it keeps the line straight. Another interesting rule is that there can't be a barrier between the hand and the Torah. I can't wear gloves that cover my hands. Another rule is that you can't write from memory. So even if I chanted this particular section at my bat mitzvah and I know it by heart, I still have to look at the written text, and I have to say each word out loud before I write it. I have the photocopy of the tikkun, so I underline each line that I write so I can follow where I am exactly. If my eye goes to the wrong place, I know where I am. It makes it easier to not make mistakes. The biggest myth about scribing that I've encountered is the myth that scribes can't make any errors, or else they have to start over from the very beginning of the Torah. If and when I make a mistake, if I catch it right then and there, I try to remove as much ink as I can, because it will be easier to scrape off.
What is something that you learned from the video that we just saw? Sherry. Yeah. 304,805 letters in the Torah, not one more, not one less. Otherwise, the entire Torah is not kosher. It's pasul. Susie.
You can make a mistake.
Oh, yeah. You can make a mistake and you can correct it. There, at the end of the Torah, there can't be any mistakes. But in the process of writing a Torah, you will make a mistake because it's inevitable. We're human. So there are ways that we do it. Now, it's not so simple as just like getting out your eraser. I have more scalpels than I ever thought I would own in my life that are now part of my regular routine. You have to scrape it away. I also have an electric sander because first in order to erase a mistake, you first scrape it away. And then you try to erase with an eraser any of the residue. But in order to get that smooth again, you sand it a little bit. But it's hard to get precise with like little pieces of parchment. So I have this little electric sander / eraser thing that makes it easy because modern tools can help, right? But yes, you can make a mistake as long as you know to fix it, right? That's the whole point, is that it must be fixed, but you can make a mistake. Anne? How long does the quill last? It really depends. So I would say that is my biggest challenge, and most people who scribe, that is their biggest challenge, because if you start with just a feather, right? And so then you have to take your scalpels and you carve it. And depending on how you carve it, there will be more, or like it's bigger or it's smaller, and it needs to match the size cloth that you're writing with. So I might trim it. I try really hard once it's done to leave it alone for as long as it'll be okay. Sometimes it gets a little bit fuzzy and you have to trim a little bit off. But the more you trim, the more you risk having to start all over. You don't want that. So it just depends on what you're writing, what kind of pressure you're putting on it. It depends on where you create the split in the middle of it and how fragile that quill is. So there's so many different factors. Yeah. I think mine are, you can use turkey feathers and duck feathers and yeah, I think kosher animal feathers basically.
What did they used to do to correct mistakes before you had all these great tools?
They would scrape it off, right? It's the same process. That hasn't changed. You would find something sharp and you would scrape it off. And they did not have a little thing that vibrated to sand it. They just get regular sandpaper and just scrape it away until it was smooth enough to write over. What else did you learn, Annetta?
Actually, a question.
Yeah.
Let's say you write the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
Is there an institute or a person somewhere who will check your work after the fact?
Yes. So one of the things that Julie spoke about and that we're going to talk about is that there are, in fact, scribal schools out there. The problem is they're closed to women and to other groups of people who would like to engage in this art and this process. And so there are different ways that have to be done. So I want to say like in the olden days, right, there were people who were scribes, and then there were people whose professions it was to check the work, because you have to have people check your work in order for it to be kosher. So in the traditional process was that you would complete your work and then two people would check it. One person to look, one person to read the text. You cannot like go by memory, even if you've done this 1,000 times. So you would have two people to check your work. If they found, I think it's something like 3 mistakes, they would have to you would correct it, but then another set of people would have to check it again, different from the first. So there's lots of kind of processes to understand that we're human and that there are human errors, even despite best intentions. Now there are computer softwares that can scan an entire column of Torah and identify mistakes. So there are less people doing the actual work of sitting with the tikkun and looking at the Torah and doing it that way. So if you're in the business of making Torahs, and there are, right, whole productions set up where there are just a bunch of people scribing in a room, and you call and you say, I want a Torah, and I want it to be on X size parchment, and they'll put one together for you rather than having a person commissioned to write your Torah. So there's ways that that modernity has become part of this as well. So, but traditionally, yes, you have to check it because it must ensure that you're not a mistake. And then part of the work of sofers and soferets now is not only to write Torahs and to create sacred texts, but also to check them and make sure that they're kosher, because the same way you can scrape off letters, sometimes over time, those words, you'll notice sometimes in a Torah that a letter or a word might look a little bit lighter than another word. And so it's our job to say, well, that is okay. You might want to fix it, but it's still kosher, versus that actually needs to be fixed or else there are problems with the entirety of the reading of Torah. So that's part of the work too, is to know enough to see whether something must be corrected or not. Susie.
How long does it take to write a Torah?
How long does it take to write a Torah? It's a great question. Everybody writes at their own pace. My understanding is that if somebody is doing this full time as their sole work, it would take about a year. Because you have to remember, there's a whole process. It's not just sitting down to write. You have to get into the right mindset. You have to set the intention. You might go to the mikvah. There's a lot of, and then there's the checking and the rechecking and the correcting and all of those pieces. So it does take a very significant amount of time. I want to move to our text. Can we hold off on questions for now because they might get answered? And then if you have them at the end, I will answer. Does that sound okay? Okay. All right, so I made kind of a little packet for us to go through first. All right, so this is kind of an introduction that I want to look at together because I want to give everybody a foundation of what is it that we're talking about, who can do it, what does it look like, and what are some specific instances that might look different than the rest. And then we'll go through some different pieces. So most of what you're going to hear talked about is that you're going to hear about Sofrut stam, which is an abbreviation. Stam stands for the 3 holy texts that must be written by scribes, right? That have specific laws governing them in such a way that are different than other texts we might write. So stam stands for Sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzot. So when we're talking about Sofrut stam, we're talking about those categories of things. Now, sofers and soferets can write other things. So for example, I'm working on Megillah right now. But there are different laws governing a Megillah than there are that govern the writing of Torahs and tefillin and mezuzot. For instance, like one of them that makes it different is that God's name isn't in Megillat Esther. There are a whole set of laws about writing God's name, about what happens if you make a mistake when you're writing God's name. Yikes, that would be really bad. But you can fix it. There are ways to do it. And so there's a whole different category of laws that have to be followed for Megillot than there are for Sefer Torah and mezuzot and tefillin, all which include God's names or categories of God's names, because there's actually multiple, as we know in Torah, many, many forms of God's names. So we might be talking about the tetragrammaton, which is Yod He Vav He, or we might be talking about Elohim or other ways that we talk about God. So we could also, sofers and soferets also write ketubot sometimes. Some people who get married and they want their ketubah not just printed, they might want a scribe to do it. That's something else that a scribe could do, but it's not of the same governing laws that we talk about that have halakha associated with them. So that's kind of the categories of pieces we're talking about. So then the important thing to look at is who can write these texts. There are a few different, I would say, authoritative texts that we look at with regards to Sofrut. One of the primary ones is Keset HaSofer, and that was written, as I wrote here, by Shlomo Gansfried in 1835. So again, the compilation and the canonization of these texts and the laws surrounding them are still altogether relatively recent in the course of Jewish history. Now it sounds like a long time ago, but Torahs have been written for far longer. But as with so many things, the laws were in lots of disparate locations. And so it took some people who came together and they started canonizing different ways of writing. So Shlomo Gansfried wrote in Slovenia in 1835, Keset HaSofer means the inkstand of the scribe, and it's the legal handbook for scribes, first book written by him. He's authored other texts as well. It includes laws of writing Torah, mezuzot, tefillin, and Megillat Esther. And he wrote the book at nights while working as a wine merchant during the day, just as a fun fact. And he writes that he was motivated to compile the book after noticing widespread ignorance on the laws of scribal writing, in part due to the lack of centralized work exclusively addressing them. So as I said, they were in lots of different places. There was no one book that you could look at that would say, what do I do about X, Y, or Z situation? He took it upon himself to compile it. Now, there are some laws that you find in Talmud. Rambam also has laws about scribing. But there are different ways of doing scribal work depending on where you're from in the world. So this is an Ashkenazi authoritative text. There's also Sephardic and Mizrahi and all different kinds of texts as well. And if you look at the lettering, they look a little bit different depending on if you're reading from a Sephardic Torah or if you're reading from an Ashkenazi Torah. So it just looks a little bit different. But some things are the same and very similar depending, regardless of where you look. And that really is the category of who can write this. And as my teacher told me, because obviously, like Julie, I don't get to go to a school. They won't accept me as a woman, as we're going to read about. So I had to seek out teachers. So I have one teacher that I study halakha with, and I have another teacher that I study the art of writing with. One is based in New York and one is based in Minnesota. So when I first sat down with my halakha teacher, he said, chapter 1 of Kesed HaSofer is in many ways a painful text to read because it's very exclusionary. And it's important for us to read so that we know what the basis is and what we're choosing to do differently. I think that's really important for liberal communities of Jews, is to understand where the law comes from, what it says, and to mindfully and intentionally values-based decisions to say, we're going to do it differently because these are our values. So, does anybody have a particular interest in reading? No? Okay, I will continue. What's that? I'm sorry, say it louder.
A woman writes a Torah.
Yeah.
Is it acceptable in every congregation, every denomination?
No. So the question was, if a woman writes a Torah, is it acceptable in every congregation and in every denomination? Unequivocally, no. So that's one of the decisions that the same way that some congregations ordain women as rabbis and cantors and others do not, the same is true for who has the authority to write sacred text. So, and it's not just women that are included in this category. So, and that's part of the painful thing, right? Is that I consider myself to be a rabbi of my community, of the Jewish people. I have a great deal of knowledge about the things that I'm doing, and yet my work would not be accepted. And that's part of what it means to choose to be a liberal Jew, is to know that that isn't going to work for everybody. And that's okay. That's part of the beauty of the Jewish people, is that we have denominations and people have the power and are empowered to choose what is the right practice for them. And that might not be the same for everybody. Charlie?
Is there a central repository? How would someone know in 100 years who wrote this?
You would not. You would not know who wrote Torah. So what I know, that because you don't sign it, there's no signature, there's no basis for who knows, for knowing where. Most of the time you'll know where a Torah might have come from, but you won't necessarily know who wrote it. I can tell you that I know that there are 35 Torahs currently in circulation that have been written by women. The first known one to have been written entirely by a woman was Jen Taylor Friedman in 2007. So there are only 35 Torahs, and which is not very many in the scheme of life. And also there are 35 Torahs that were written by women. So it's growing, it's important. So I'm going to kind of read through some of Kesed HaSofer, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit, okay? So first, in this first section, really what he's outlining here are the stakes. He's got to make us really mindful of what it means to do this work. So he's got to outline the stakes for us. It's taught in a Baraita, which is in the Talmud, that Rabbi Meir said, when I came to Rabbi Ishmael, he said to me, my son, what is your trade? I said to him, I am a scribe. He said to me, my son, be meticulous in your work, for it is the work of heaven. And if you should omit a single letter or add a single letter, you destroy the entire world. From this, we may see that a scribe must be in extreme awe of God. For if he makes one error or fails to make one necessary correction, his soul will perish because he steals from the masses and causes them to sin. They remain in a state of not performing commandments and every day make blessings in vain. Of him it is written, one sinner destroys such good in Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes. And cursed is he who does God's work deceitfully in Jeremiah. Therefore, those who have the power to appoint scribes should appoint worthy scribes, men of truth who hate bribes and know Torah, Fear God and tremble at God's words, just as we appoint kosher butchers. So the stakes here, what he's trying to impress upon us, and he does it in a quite dramatic way, right? Like he does this in a dramatic way. However, what we remember here is a mistake, right? In the world of halacha, if we believe that we are supposed to wrap tefillin every day or read Torah, if your work is wrong and people unknowingly read from that work, read from Torah that's pasul, that's not kosher, they haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, they have not fulfilled their obligation to read Torah and to do the work of wrapping tefillin or all of these other pieces. Because when you make a blessing in aliyah over Torah, you are assuming that the reading of that Torah scroll is kosher. So that is why we have to be meticulous in our work, because it's not just about us making a mistake, it's about the communities who will read from that Torah. And that's why it's such an important thing. And so we need to make sure that the people who are writing sacred texts are upstanding citizens and people who are in good faith and are in extreme awe of God. And as we're going to see, they have to be of certain categories of people. And we're going to read ahead. Okay, in number 2 at the top. Sifrei Torah, tefillin, and mezuzot, which were written by a heresaiach, are burned. That is a heretic. If they were written by a non-Jew, one who rejects commandments, a woman, a deaf-mute, one mentally impaired, or a minor, they are invalid and are buried, as it says, bind them and write them. The explanation that is all that who are enjoined in binding are enjoined in writing, and those who are not enjoined in writing or are not commanded or believed to be performing it reliably are not enjoined in writing. And then it goes on to say how we know somebody has reached adulthood, which means that he has 2 hairs. It's important to know. But these categories of people, we're talking about entire classes of people, entire groups of people who are excluded from this mitzvah. And what it talks about is it goes back to the Talmud, this quote, which is in Gittin, and it talks about the fact that if you're not obligated to wrap tefillin, to bind them, to wrap them, if you're not obligated in the commandments, how could you possibly write the texts that allow people to perform the commandments? And that's also a challenge for those of us who are egalitarian, who are inclusive, and who believe that gender or ability shouldn't limit our participation in Jewish life. So we're making values-based decisions anytime we decide that we're going to do things differently and to be egalitarian and to live different values. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that I choose to do this. I think that there are so many ways in life that we can be inclusive, and that people who, we talk about the idea of who counts as a Jew. That is important. We talk about sexuality, about gender, about all of these different pieces that as liberal congregations have full authority to lead us, who are clergy, who are able to be authorities in so many ways. And yet this area of Jewish ritual practice and life really, until pretty recently, has been something that's remained unclaimed. We've become clergy, we lead communities, and yet the writing of our Torahs and the writing of the things that make holy clay kodesh, holy vessels, we have not yet claimed as our own. And that's seen by the fact that we're just really in the 2nd generation of women scribes at this point, and of people who are choosing to do things a little bit differently. I think for a long time, most of us rely on a much different kind of choice for our sacred texts than what we embody in our other synagogue values. So, for example, one of my, you asked if it would be accepted if I wrote a Torah. And the answer is no. So one of the first things my teacher in New York told me is that when she is approached to write texts or to correct or to repair or to even commission new things, she ensures that she has a conversation whereupon she discloses that obviously she's a woman and she's a queer woman. And if that is going to be a challenge for people in the community, then she is not the right person to repair their texts or to write new texts. So it's something that we have to be aware of, that not every community is going to have the same choices and going to feel good about different people writing in them, because it is a departure from what an orthodox, and I say that with a lowercase o, not the movement, but what a more traditional interpretation of the text would be. And yet, I'm a Reform rabbi. I'm already choosing to do things differently. My community already embodies different values. And so to include and be more inclusive in who repairs and cares for our Torahs is something that we value and is something that I value, and is one of the things that drove me to be encouraged to pursue this. Everything has to be precise and exact and everything's the same except when it's not. Okay? So except when it's not, which means that in Vayikra, which we just read a few weeks ago, for example, the first word of Vayikra, there's a small aleph. It's tiny comparatively. Why is that? There's Midrash on it. I'm going to let you read it. It has to do with Moses, according to the rabbis, it has to do with how humble Moses is, and that he didn't feel that he should be singled out in a specific way. So I brought a quote from Jonathan Sacks, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, who helps to unpack that. Another instance that you might see, and there's a picture in it, is in Parshat Pinchas. There's a broken vav in the word shalom. If you look at it, you'll see that the vav is kind of cut in two. And you won't see that anywhere else. Anywhere else in the Torah, that would be deemed not kosher, but it is specifically broken here because it's the covenant of peace that God bestows upon Pinchas, but he just committed a terrible atrocity. So why are we giving him a covenant of peace? So the Midrash says it's actually a broken piece until we do the work of making it whole. So there's the same way that when we chant Torah, that the music gives a little bit of interpretation, the way it's written also gives interpretation. So I think I'm going to move, and also we're not going to get a chance to read it, but I really would love for you to read this. This is an article that came out in November, I believe, from Hadassah, that really chronicles the work of female scribes and how it's really rewriting the role in so many ways of what it means to be a scribe. And it gives a lot about some particular journeys that I think is very interesting. It's really a small pool of people right now. The first generation are teaching the next generation. So I feel very fortunate that I get to be learning from people who embody my values and don't have to seek out somebody who might be willing to work with me but wouldn't see me as a rabbi or as qualified to do this work. Charlie.
Well, how do they decide which is a definitive Torah to copy from?
So that goes back to the Masoretic text. So we use that text, and then there's different schools of writing. And so when I write the way she did a Torah Tikkun page, and those kind of are just the authoritative text at this point that we use. So you don't have to seek it out. It exists for you. You know what it should look like. It's a little ink blotty, but you can get the idea. It has, on every side, it has it has numbers, right? And on each line, it'll show you what it needs to have in it. And it will also tell you that there's a chet or there's a yud, right? Not in this one, but okay. So here it will say chet, which means that there's less space, so you have to kind of squish letters, and it'll tell you how many. So it says like chaser daled, which means that the spacing of proportionality looks like this. It's a grid. So I know every square, like I said, it's a science. So when I take my quill, you can see that it has a specific, like the length of that tip, right? That's called, the quill is called a kulmus. Not getting it very good there. Quill is called a kulmus. The amount of one block is 1 kulmus length, okay? Which is why getting your quill size is very important, because it has to be proportional, because it has to be proportional to the Torah scroll or this text that you're writing in. So each one of these is 1 block long, okay? So I know that in this line of the Torah tikkun page that I am missing 4 spaces, 4 kulmus lengths long, I'm missing. So I need to know as a soferet that I have to scrunch it just a little bit in the right places, versus in other places like here in line 21, I have extra space. So I stretch it a little bit, which is and like it depends on the abilities of the scribe and how they do it, whether or not they stretch one letter to cover a long space, which you might see there. You might look at a long daled, or you might look like a really long hey, because there are 5 really stretchable letters and some that you can't stretch at all. So a really good scribe will know that exactly enough that it won't really look like it's stretched. It's just an internal notice. But somebody who's a beginner like me, I might get to an end of a line and be like, oh, I actually did not do that exactly correct because I'm not as practiced. And so my letter toward the end, you might see a longer letter.
So are there page numbers or some indication of pages in the Torah?
No.
So how do you, if I were to say,
Like this is,
page 36, line 21, and every Torah,
you would have to find it in the Torah. So like I know that in Megillat Esther, that I'm on, this is column 9, because it says on Mud Tet. So I know that I'm copying column 9 in Megillat Esther, but it's not numbered in the Torah or in the Megillah. You just have to be able to find it. So it is a precise but complicated craft. If you're learning how to write, you might use a practice quill tip or a plastic one, which is totally kosher and fine to use. Most people who are doing this more carve their own, because you have to get a different quill tip for every number and different like size of cloth that you have, and you can't adjust it. So it's because it's hard plastic. So it's really good for learning. And at a certain point, you can choose to continue using it or choose to do something else. I'm going to try and do a quick demo. That would be great. Just so you can see it, demos I did a few weeks ago. So I want to point out a couple of things. So one of the reasons that it is important to be precise is because it's really easy for one letter to look like another, and that's the big problem. You can't have a bet that looks too much like a kaf. So can you see this one? So if you round it too much, it doesn't look like a bet. This looks like a bet. This doesn't look like a bet. If you extend the daled too much and you round it out, it will look like a resh. So you have to be really precise and really careful about what you do. I also like to show the pay, because the pay is very special. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. The pay has a secret letter inside of it. Can you guys see the secret letter? In this one right here. So the secret letter inside of it, it goes with a Midrash. So the tradition is that God spoke the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, right? And that law, we have oral Torah, we have written Torah, but it comes ba'al peh, which is the mouth, right? And the first letter, does anybody know the first word of Torah? Bereshit, which starts with a bet. So the first words out of the mouth, Ba'al Peh, Bereshit, there is a bet inside the peh, if you look for it. So there's all sorts of ways that that we find Midrash and we find interpretation woven in to the ways that we write Torah. So I have my kulmuz. I dipped it in ink. This is my ink pot. And then unlike in English, when you write at the bottom of a piece, right, like you get a line of paper, you write it at the bottom. It might go up to the top, it might not. On cloth, you write at the top of the line. So you write and you get your starting point, you make your line. It should be nice and crisp. And then you have to count, right? If you have, I was using a bigger quill tip before, so this is a different quill tip. I need to make sure that it's in line with that grid that I showed you. So I know that I need to go about this far down, make my second line out, and then connect it here for a bet. And then they have these things which are called tagin, which are the little crowns and the dots. So you can see that that's kind of how you craft and write different letters, and they build on each other. So the first letter I learned how to do is a bet, because it's always good to start with the beginning of Torah. The second letter, as you'll see over here, that I learned is a daled, because they build off each other. So you do a daled, you make your line, and then you have this leg that comes down and a little flowery point that comes off. You make your tagin, and they come down that way. But then you take that same thing and you build on it, and that becomes a tav and a hey. So they have kind of building block skills. So you go this way. You make the same leg down with the dalet. Child that is learned enough in their aleph bet, but that couldn't infer what you might be trying to write and make assumptions, and you cover up everything around it and you say, what is this letter? And if they say it's a bet, then it's a bet. And if they say, wow, that looks a little bit like a kaf that's kind of funky on the bottom, then it's a kaf and you have to fix it. You can do it with one child, you can do it with like a group, but you need to like an odd group, because there has to be a consensus. But I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of Torah, is that you can't have a kosher Torah without children present, and that's the way that we ensure that it's taught from generation to generation, is that it's through understanding that it's a process and that our children are a part of that process. So I have my very own personal checker at home, which is really great, because Rabbi is 6 years old, and it's like usually like 6 to pre-b'nai mitzvah age that is the right category of folks. So he's learned his aleph bet. He has not learned it enough to know that I'm trying to write Bereshit, and I'd really like for him to tell me that it's a bet, and he can tell me what he thinks it is, which is convenient, because then I don't have to go find one right now. But so that's how it works. Questions? Charlie? I feel much more ownership of Torah and of sacred texts since learning this. I feel like I understand the gravitas that comes with the creation of sacred texts, and I feel empowered to take that on myself. And I still approach Torah with such awe and such wonder, and I have an intimate knowledge that I can do that too. And that's really empowering. And I also feel really connected to other people who do this work. I feel like it's opened up a new community in terms of other ways that I can connect with people over what it means to be Jewish and what it means to live our values. And I feel like I know much more even about, I'm learning Midrash, I'm learning more halacha, I'm learning a lot more that I wouldn't have known before because I just took a class on this, that, or the other thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Rabbi, as somebody whose penmanship is nothing to
Yeah.
think about, I'm curious, before this, were you somebody who enjoyed writing by hand, or we all
Yes.
have those friends who are amazing at that. So
Yes, that is. So
it's a whole new level. But
I have always liked lettering and art, and have a background in art. And before I decided to be a rabbi, I was pursuing a BFA and in an art degree, and I realized soon that wasn't the right career path for me. But I've always looked for ways to integrate my love of art with my passion for Judaism, and this was really one of the ways that I saw as an opportunity to do that. Yeah. But you can be a sofer and a sofer without great penmanship. You just have to work really hard at it. Anything else? Yeah.
Are most soferettes or sofers also rabbis or cantors?
No, I would say there's a few who are, but a lot of them are just really learned folks who wanted to take the next step in doing this work. Neither of my teachers are rabbis. One is just somebody like my Deana, who's taught me the art part of it. She does a lot of work in Torah repair, and she does a lot of work in ketubot. She also writes the smichot, or the ordination certificates for Yeshivat Hadar, which is, Yeshivat Maharat, which is where the Orthodox movement is ordaining female spiritual leaders. So she writes their smichot by hand. And it was a passion that she pursued, and she's really great at it. My halakha teacher doesn't do he does a lot of repair work, and he does teaching of halakha because he's very learned. But his primary part is that he processes his own hide and parchment because he wants it to be ethically sourced and different. He does it a little bit differently to make it a more intentional spiritual process. So he that's his primary work as a sofer, is to create parchment. Mm-hmm.
For something that has to be so uniform, how do people have different styles of doing this?
So it's not so much of a different style that the naked eye would see. It all should look relatively similar, but like the way that I make this little extra part right here might look a teeny bit different than my teacher's. So some people might make like a half sofit looks like it only has to look like this, okay? But my teacher, what she always says, pull a little flare on the end of it right there. So you can add very minute, gentle touches that don't affect the kashrut of a letter, but they all should look relatively uniform. The way I make my hay might look a little bit different than how Julie makes hers. How I make my tav, which I just realized I made look like a hay instead, and nobody told me. Because I was talking at the same time. Usually I don't talk at the same time. The way that I start my tav might look a little different than the way somebody else does theirs. But all of them should be pretty uniform because they have to fit in the same piece. And also the letters that I'm doing are part of the Beit Yosef scribal tradition. So everybody who's working in that scribal tradition will look similar. If you're in a different scribal tradition, it might look a little bit different. Yes?
I'm just curious about the economics. I don't know what a Torah costs. And the question I have is also, is there a guild, and the guild is what keeps women out? Or is it more religious based?
Well, the schools can keep women out, right? Because of they have the ability, just like anybody else, to admit or not admit students. And the thing that has kept certain categories of people out is people's belief in halakha and in how these categories of laws were written. So it's not a guild of people saying women can't do it. It's not access to education. And it took for women and other people who fall into these categories, differently abled people, queer folks, to come together and say, we can own this tradition too, and we're going to start learning and we're going to build it ourselves. And that takes time. So, and it's about knowing or having communities that will want to use those works and want to use those Torahs and want to invest in this different group of people, which might not have as much, access and regular abilities to be reachable than others.
But when you scratch a lot of surfaces, economics also involved. What's a Torah cost?
I think a Torah, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, to commission a Torah for your congregation, I mean, think about it as the cost of a Torah, the materials, which are expensive, plus somebody's full-time salary. So you might be looking at $150,000, $200,000 for a Torah.
So the more, theoretically, the more they're on the market, the more people who can write it, to drive costs down.
It could.
Make it more available.
Torahs are widely available at this point, but the cost comes from the amount of work that goes into it. Yeah. Justin, did you have a last question?
Just, my thought is if you're a small congregation and you don't have a Torah, and the value of the Torah is reading that, if it were mass produced for the congregants, isn't that a different value than the whole historical, traditional way of writing a Torah?
I think it depends on what your values are. I think that having a Torah to read from feels different than opening a Chumash, because it is inherently different. There's a difference in terms of something that's written by hand versus something that goes through the printer. And what we have to remember is that not every Torah has to be commissioned new. It costs far less to. There are congregations that sell Torahs when they decide they don't need one. There are congregations that, if you're small, that there are Torahs that become donated. There are ways to get Torahs without commissioning a brand new one, which is why most scribes don't only work in the business of writing new Torahs, but in repairing older Torahs as well. Because a Torah could last a couple hundred years.